We are live.
Thanks, Declan. Let me say good afternoon to everyone who's here. Sorry, we're starting a few minutes late. I was given a bunch of questions. I have, I think, close to 24 questions. But anybody who's here who wants to submit a question can do so. Declan, would you tell folks how they can do that?
Yep. If you would like to submit a question, you can do so by putting it in the chat on Facebook Live, or you can message the chairman's social media accounts, or you can email chairmancs@dccouncil.gov.
And you, Declan, are monitoring all of those right now.
That is correct.
Okay. Do you need to state what the social media accounts are?
That is CHMN Mendelson on Twitter, Chairman Phil Mendelson on Facebook, and I believe Phil Mendelson on Instagram.
Okay. Or email CS. Say that again. The email address is
chairmancs@dccouncil.gov.
all right. So let me go through the questions. I'm going to read the questions, answer them, and then I will open up to any other questions there are. And I'm going to just read the questions as they were given to me, I think edited slightly by staff. So the first question is, thank you for passing the Metro for DC bill. I have slept on the street after a late night restaurant shift because I could not make it home. 24-hour bus service on 12 lines will mean that that will never happen again for DC residents. Thank you. My question is about the rest of the bill. I understand the bill includes unfunded sections that would give DC residents $100 per month on their smart trip if they do not receive any other federal or local subsidy. The council has the opportunity to fund these sections during the upcoming FY24 budget season. Will you? So this is my answer. The chances are that it will not be funded in this year's budget for a couple of reasons. One, the fare-free bus service is going to cost the city between $40 and $50 million a year. To add to that, and the Metro rail subsidy would add substantially to that, is more money than I think the council wants to put out for this particular initiative this year. Second, there are changes taking place with WMATA and its fee structure. For instance, they're now offering more discounts for low-income individuals on the rail side. And we want to see how all of this plays out, both the discounts on the rail side as well as the fare-free bus service, see what that does to ridership and what WMATA would be telling us would be the cost for the rail subsidy. Third, the way the bill, the rail subsidy, which as the questioner noted was about $100 a month, that's the way the bill was introduced for both the bus and rail, and we revised the bus side to be fare free. But that structure was not the most economically efficient for the city. And what I mean by that is that there were other ways to approach the subsidies that would not have cost the city as much. And that would all need to be developed. All of which is to say that this is complicated enough that I don't think we'll be doing anything more with it this year with regard to the rail side. It will be enough for us to effect the fare-free bus service as well as the all-night service on those 12 busiest bus lines. This is actually a big deal. I'm proud of what we did, and it was quite different than the bills introduced or the bill that went through Committee on Transportation. It was revised in the Committee of the Whole by me, although I do want to give credit to Charles Allen because he was the original author of the bill and has been supportive throughout. So it will be enough for us to do the bus side this year, see how the numbers play out, the best way to go forward with a subsidy on the rail side, and do that in the future. The second question. There are currently only 10 dedicated pickleball courts in DC. For comparison, there are 138 outdoor tennis courts. Will you support adding $600,000 to the budget this year to address this issue so DPR, that's Department of Parks and Recreation, can install more dedicated courts throughout DC? If the mayor's budget doesn't include funding for dedicated courts, will you push the Committee on Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Services to add it? Well, the candid answer is I probably won't push the committee, and I don't know that 600,000 is the right amount. I think that the council needs to hear more about this from the proponents, and I have gotten a fair number of emails from pickleball proponents in the last 4 days. I don't know that $600,000 is the right amount or where that number comes from. I don't know where these pickleball courts would be located. And frankly, the way our council is organized, we have committees. The questioner acknowledged that there's the Committee on Recreation, Libraries, and Youth Services or Youth Affairs. That's the committee with the expertise, and that's the committee that should consider and develop this proposal. In the end, the full council, of course, has to vote on the budget. So the advocates for pickleball should be lobbying all of us, but this question was specifically, will I push and will I support? And I think this needs to be more developed through the Committee on Recreation, Youth Affairs, and Libraries. The third question, will you file a notice of disapproval to the mayor's proposal to take $2.5 million for the temporary family housing program and to use it for an MPD impound lot? We must fund the solutions to our housing crisis. Housing the poor and addressing the dire needs of our neighbors makes us all safer. Parking lots do not. Well, my answer is going to have to be complicated here. I would agree that housing makes us safer and parking lots do not. I don't know the MPD's need for this impound lot. But I don't know that I want to get into that. I'm guessing that the reason why the mayor's submitted this proposal is because the money isn't being spent or can't be spent this year, even though the council budgeted for it. The council has been quite generous in funding affordable housing programs. And some of the programs we have gotten ahead of the capacity, that is the ability to fully develop whatever that program is. In this case, the temporary family housing program. Now, I say that without knowing for sure that that's the case. But the question is, will I file disapproval? Based on what I know, I won't. However, if Councilmember Robert White, who chairs the Housing Committee, and as I noted with the last question, I'm trying to defer more to the committees where the expertise should be. If Councilmember White comes to me and he says, hey, this housing program, not only is necessary, but actually they can be spending the money this year. There is the capacity. There is the ability to move forward with it. We shouldn't be taking the money from this. And Councilmember White says I join him in filing a disapproval, then the answer would be yes. So to simplify my answer, I don't know enough about what's going on with the temporary family housing program. I don't know what's going on with the MPD impound lot. And so I look to others on the council who have the committees with jurisdiction. And if they say that the money can't be spent on the housing, then I see no reason to get in the way. And if they say that the money can be spent, then yes, I'll support my colleagues. Next question, why are you supporting more lenient sentences for criminals in DC? Well, I appreciate the way that is written, but it's a lot more complicated than that. I'm sure that it's a question that refers to the recent revisions to the criminal code. I fully supported the revisions to the criminal code, and I fully supported the override of the mayor's veto, and I was very critical of the mayor for demagoguing the issue because there's a long body of research that shows that sentences and the length of sentences does not have a deterrent effect on crime. And that may sound strange to folks, but if you think about it, we have a lot of very harsh sentences possible sentences in our criminal code, and yet we see murders continue despite a 30-year mandatory minimum. We see robberies continue despite 15, 20-year maximum sentences, depending upon whether it's armed or not armed, the robbery. That's not to say that sentences don't have a value, but it is to say that when the mayor says that the changes to the sentencing are going to make the city more dangerous, that's just not correct. But I want to read this from the criminal code sentencing revision. The executive director, he wrote a letter after the mayor sent her veto letter. Mayor Bowser warned that the revised criminal code will weaken penalties and make the district less safe. This argument assumes both that the criminal code will significantly reduce sentences and that such a reduction will weaken deterrence and increase crime rates. In fact, the penalties authorized under the revised criminal code for any given offense, the penalties authorized are higher than nearly all sentences currently imposed by DC Superior Court judges. For example, Mayor Bowser raised concerns that the revised criminal code, quote, substantially reduced penalties for robberies, unquote. However, the revised criminal code 16-year maximum penalty for robbery is 5 times higher than the median sentence imposed for robbery and 5 years higher than the 97.5th percentile sentence imposed for robbery. Let me interrupt for a second. That number, 97.5 percentile, is a little odd, but that's because the Criminal Code Revision Commission had access to Superior Court sentencing data and had to respect certain confidentiality constrictions. So they could analyze below the 97th, or report, I should say, publicly report below the 97.5th percentile. In some cases, the revised criminal code increases penalties. For example, the mayor is justifiably concerned about gun violence in the district. The revised criminal code increases penalties for possession of assault rifles, ghost guns, and restricted explosive devices from 4 to 4 years from 1 year under current law. It also creates a new offense, endangerment with a firearm. That's the new offense, endangerment with a firearm, which criminalizes discharging a firearm in a public place. That's a new offense, or discharging a firearm in a manner that creates a substantial risk of death. Most of the revised criminal code penalty ranges fall squarely in the range of current sentencing practice, while creating a more transparent code that allows prosecutors to bring additional charges and penalties based on the severity of the conduct. Moreover, even to the extent that the statutory maximum penalties are lowered for some specific offenses, the assumption that marginally lowering statutory maximum penalties will weaken deterrence and increase crime rates is entirely unsupported by criminological research, which is what I said before about a long body of research. The research actually shows that what has a deterrent effect is swift and certain justice. That is, closing cases quickly with an arrest and prosecuting quickly and aggressively with a conviction. That has a deterrent effect, not whether a sentence is 15 years or 20 years or 2 years versus 4 years. But I want to add one other thing, and that is that the construct of the new code is one that I liken to layers. So there's an offense, and then there's a layer of a second offense on top of the first one. So if somebody is caught with an unregistered firearm, let's say the firearm is in their house, not being used, nobody's touching it, there's no crime associated with it, but it's unregistered, so that is against the law. There is a penalty for that. If the firearm is on the individual outside the house, that's carrying, that's an additional offense. If the firearm is used in the commission or attempted commission of a crime, that is an additional offense with regard to that firearm. And so very quickly, the maximum penalty for those 3 layers is substantially more than the original offense for just the possession of the unregistered firearm in the person's house. And that's the way this code is constructed. And so if you only look at what the current penalty is for an unregistered firearm with what is proposed here in the revised code, you'll get very different numbers, but look at how that gun is being used outdoors, and in actually a commission of a crime. then the penalties are in some cases more severe with the revised criminal code. So there's been a lot of rhetoric. It's easy for this rhetoric to exist with regard to crime, that we're supporting lenient sentences. But I'm confident that this code is well researched and will not make it easier for criminals. In fact, I think it'll make it easier for the prosecutors, even though the U.S. Attorney has raised some objections, make it easier for prosecutors because with the layers, there's more opportunity for plea bargaining, which means easier for the U.S. Attorney, the prosecutors to get convictions. And so I'll move on to the next question. I'm sure you saw Kyle Racine's comments in the Washington Post saying that he is also afraid of being carjacked while filling his car up with gas in DC. Do you have any advice for DC residents on how not to be carjacked while running errands in DC? I'm older and can't imagine having my car stolen. Let me just say that my former partner had her car carjacked while she was at a gas pump a few years ago, and it was a horrible experience. She was not harmed. Doesn't matter. It was a horrible experience. I also think it was irresponsible for Kyle Racine to say what he said. I actually drive an electric vehicle, so I don't go to gas stations anymore, but I actually sometimes will rent a car and it's a gas guzzler, and I do have to go to gas stations, and I'm not afraid to go to a gas station. But I will say this, everybody has their own risk tolerance, and I don't begrudge that at all. But if somebody's concerned about being carjacked, pick a gas station that's on a busy street, go to that gas station during the day, during the daylight, and be very aware of your surroundings. Be very, very aware of your surroundings. If there's anything about the gas station that makes you uncomfortable, go to a different gas station. And when you are at the gas pump, have your purse or your wallet with you, and have your keys with you. So nobody should be afraid, but some folks are, and we as a city government need to work harder at making the city safer and feel safer to everyone. Next question. I know that OSSI is working on the major bus issues, but disabled students are missing their legally mandated educational and service hours. What can the council do to help? Well, it just happens that I spent maybe a half an hour today talking to the head of OSSI, the Office of State Superintendent on Education, Dr. Christina Grant, about what is happening with OSSI bus service. They made changes to the bus routes beginning January 9th. And so that those changes caused some disruption, but more problematic was that they had a very large number of call-outs, and they've been working on reducing those call-outs. That means bus drivers who called out sick. I don't think that it was intentional. I don't think there was a work stoppage. But it was a large number. And in fact, I think what she told me today was that the average for the last 2 weeks has been about 70 or more than 70 drivers calling out each day. Today, the number was lower, and they're working on getting it lower. I did press her on what they're doing to be more reliable, because that's important. And I can't promise that there will not continue to be some missteps, but it does appear that they're getting it under control, and that there will be less late pickups and drop-offs, and that the service will be more reliable. I also pressed the superintendent with regard to the number to call, the hotline, because the wait times have been way too long when somebody calls. I think the average on January 9th was 45 minutes. That means there were a lot who were on hold a lot longer. And in my view, that's just unacceptable. And the superintendent knows that. So I'm going to keep pressing her on this. But my impression is that they're working hard to get this under control. They also have a new transportation director. There was a second question related to this. OSSI continues to fail with transportation, and the recent changes only made things worse. Parents are being forced to transport their children to and from school with pennies for reimbursement. When will your committee hold OSSI accountable to basic standards on getting children to and from school both on time and safely? Well, as I said, I had a long talk with the chancellor today. I've exchanged some communications with her over the past week. We're going to have a performance oversight hearing. I believe it's the very beginning of March. I don't have that date in front of me. If Declan has it, interrupt. Otherwise, folks can go to the council's website, www.dccouncil.gov, and get the complete hearing schedule for all the committees. So the oversight hearing will be an opportunity for the public to testify as well as for the superintendent to answer questions. And I want to note that I also talked to the superintendent. If I said chancellor, I meant superintendent. I talked to the superintendent about increasing the reimbursement rate for parents who are driving their kids and picking their kids up. These are kids with special needs with an IEP. So it's not just any parent who wants to drive their kid and get reimbursed, but if there's a individualized education plan for the student, then there is some entitlement to transportation, and the superintendent is looking to increase the reimbursement rate. What I felt was honestly my best observation in 5 years in DCPS resulted in my lowest ever impact score. The students earned high scores on the lesson which shows what I taught. They were able to internalize and apply. Isn't that the goal? Why haven't any changes to impact occurred? People are leaving the profession because of it. So that was the question. I'm concerned about impact. I will be honest, I'm not at the point where I think the impact should be thrown out. And I know that the teachers union is unhappy with me about that position. But I have pressed the chancellor on this, and the chancellor insists that he's made some changes to impact. I feel some dubiousness about that. And I've pressed the chancellor, if you've made changes, why aren't people aware what the changes are? Why isn't this more transparent? We had in my view, a very good hearing on teacher turnover last December. And one of the issues that was clear in my mind with regard to turnover or reducing turnover was impact and the need for the chancellor to be more transparent with teachers about what changes have been made and what changes will be made and what changes he's considering to make. It's clear from the questioner here, which included in part why haven't any changes to impact occurred, that the chancellor has failed in that communication. So I don't think we throw out impact. Impact clearly does need to be reformed. There was an analysis done at DCPS's request because of all the criticism. An analysis done by American University over a year ago that found that there was racial bias in impact assessments. And if for no other reason, there need to be changes. But if the chancellor wants to reduce turnover, then he's got to say much more about impact and be open to improvements. And that is one of my criticisms of the chancellor, that he's just not been clear, even after the hearing has not been clear. Next question. You said in an interview that you'd like DC to be on par with Paris when it comes to the Height Act, but we need more housing. Paris is twice as dense as DC. Are you open to more upzoning like Paris as well? A lot in that question, actually. So it is a defining characteristic of this city, of our city, its horizontal skyline. I will admit, you go to New York City, Manhattan, and it is dynamic with all those skyscrapers. But you come to DC and it's beautiful with our skyline that's marked by certain monuments, if you will, like the National Cathedral or the Washington Monument or the old post office tower. This is beauty. The fact is that the development of DC is well below what the Height Act permits. Zoning is well below, in many areas, what the Height Act permits. So there is plenty of room for development within existing zoning, and there is plenty of room within the Height Act for increases in zoning to allow more development. It does not necessarily follow that if we scuttle the Height Act, that we will get more housing. There is enough development envelope available right now, and yet there isn't more housing being built. And that's because of economic factors, whether those economic factors are market demand or the ability of developers to develop that much, or financing, which right now is more costly because of interest rates. There are many reasons, but it's the economics that are holding back the development of housing. I would add that our housing crisis here is no different than the housing crisis in other cities. I am active in the National League of Cities. I meet with my peers from other city councils, other city council presidents, and much of what we talk about is the housing crisis in San Francisco or in Philadelphia or New York, which, by the way, has skyscrapers and a housing crisis. What we also see with New York is that skyscrapers actually, there's more expensive housing. Manhattan arguably is not affordable. And so getting rid of the Height Act doesn't necessarily result in fact, I would say doesn't result in affordable housing, and getting rid of the Height Act isn't going to necessarily get us more housing, but it would very much change the character of our city. When the comprehensive plan was before the council 2 years ago, I managed that bill through the council because it was in the committee of the whole. And we made a number of changes to increase density. Now, the comprehensive plan is not in itself a zoning map, but it allows the zoning commission in turn to increase zoning, to increase density. So yes, there has been more. I'm open to upzoning because we did that to the comprehensive plan. I will add one other thing. I have no idea if Paris is twice as dense as DC. I know there's some areas of Paris that are pretty dense, but there's some areas of DC that are pretty dense. But the Height Act is a defining characteristic of our city, and it's a beautiful city with our horizontal skyline. Next question, how are the mayor and Washington Teachers Union still haggling over the teacher contract when teachers already voted on a detailed agreement? The contract came to the council 2 days ago, and my office is in conversations with Councilmember Bonds about having a roundtable with representatives of the teachers union and the executive on the contract next week. I think it'll be February 1st. This will not be anybody can come and testify hearing, at least I don't think it will be, because the issue here is not whether teachers should get paid more, but really whether the contract that was submitted to the council is actually the contract that the teachers union bargained for. And there's some collateral issues like how's the executive paying for this, and parity with the charter sector. So we just got the contract. I can't speak to the delay, so I'll move to the next question. I can't speak to the delay because I had nothing to do with it. My constituents and I have been reaching out to DDOT for years in regards to finishing the design of East Capitol Street corridor. Somehow the council was able to find money for free buses, but here we are in Ward 7 still waiting for additional funding in the next fiscal year. I challenge all DC government to look into this matter because I'm tired of the accidents, speeding, etc., and it doesn't seem my side of the city gets a fair shake. So what is my answer here? I think that the ANCs and the community associations and citizens along the East Capitol corridor should press the council when we get the budget, press DDOT and the mayor now to ensure that the budget includes funding to implement the improvements to East Capitol Street and to improve pedestrian safety and just make it better functioning. And my office is open to residents of Ward 7 talking to me about this as well, so that we can see how much money is necessary and see that it's included in the budget that we will have. We'll be getting the budget March 22nd. Next question. Many voters believe that city council is enabling criminal behavior and destroying the quality of life in the city. Examples include waiving penalties for metro fare evasion, revising the criminal code to weaken penalties, cheapening respect for public transport by making bus rides free, allowing homeless encampments to fester, and demonizing police. What plans do you have to lead the council in a different direction? Well, I appreciate the question. As chair of the council, one would think that I can just lead the council in one direction or another. And it's not that I'm oblivious to the fact that I have some influence, but I have 12 colleagues, each of whom was independently elected, and I do not control. I did not support decriminalizing metro fare evasion. It's against the law to steal a $2 Coke from a store, and it should be against the law to steal $2 from Metro by jumping the fare gate turnstiles. We will eliminate the problem of fare jumping for buses when we go to the free fare bus service on July 1st. I completely disagree with the questioner that making bus rides free is destroying the quality of life in the city. I actually think that's a major improvement. In fact, I'm almost want to pause here because I just really disagree with that. Making bus rides in the district free will improve public transit. We want people to be using public transit. It will reduce gridlock on our streets. It will have some environmental benefit because particularly clean buses are cleaner than gas using automobiles. So let me see, metro fare evasion, I didn't support that. Revising the criminal code to weaken penalties, I already spoke to that. Cheapening respect for public transport by making bus rides free, completely disagree with that sentiment. Allowing homeless encampments to fester, well, there was division in the council about supporting the mayor's program to survey the residents of these tent encampments, find placements for them, and then close the encampments. I supported the mayor with that. There was disagreement in the council. The council ended up supporting the mayor and moving forward. So it's not accurate to characterize the council as allowing homeless encampments to fester when we actually supported the mayor and her plan and implementation of shutting them down. And demonizing police. Well, where the council was in 2020 is not where the council is today. So I don't think it's fair to say that we're demonizing police. I don't think accountability, holding police officers accountable is the same as demonizing police. We had a fight last year, or debate last year. I support the mayor in trying to restore the school resource officers to our schools. The council was an 8-5 vote by which I lost, but I would not characterize that as demonizing the police. The next question, DC's budget is a mind-boggling $19.5 billion. Cities of comparable size have far smaller budgets. To what extent is this disparity due to the city allegedly having state responsibilities that other cities do not have, versus being a matter of waste, lack of oversight, and inability of the council to set realistic priorities? I'm not quite sure how to react to that question. Yes, $19.5 billion is a lot of money. There are other large cities that have budgets that are less than that, but not much less than that. The largest cities have budgets that are larger. To suggest that the disparity is, quote, allegedly having state responsibilities, unquote, is interesting because we do have state responsibilities. So unlike any other city, we have state, county, city, and school board all in our one budget. And A lot of our budget is federal highway dollars. A lot of our budget is federal Medicaid money, which goes to the states. Federal welfare programs like TANF. All that is part of our budget. And I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I want to say that the local dollars are closer to like 11 or 12 billion dollars. So a couple of years ago, I did get the council to agree to establish an expenditure commission to look at our expenditures and identify programs that were not accomplishing anything and programs that were duplicative and could somehow be reorganized to be more efficient. This was not to look at policy, but rather just simply to look at expenditures with an eye toward unnecessary or duplicative expenditures. The mayor was not supportive. She didn't veto it, but she never made her appointments, and the pandemic hit and the expenditure commission never got off the ground. I'd be interested in resurrecting that. I don't know if it will happen with this year's budget because right now we're preoccupied on tax reform. There's a tax revision commission that's looking at the revenue side of the government. But in any event, to answer the question more simply, the disparity of us compared to other cities, I'm not sure is that great, but to the extent that we have a larger budget, it's because we do have state, county, city, and school board functions. And there is always in government some waste, and I would like to see us eliminate that. Next question, Phil. We want more officers walking and biking on Capitol Hill. MPD leaders have told us they don't have the manpower to have dedicated officers walking and biking, and Chief Conti recently said it'll be years to recover from the Charles Allen staffing cuts to MPD. Is there anything the council can do in the interim to get more officers walking and biking on Capitol Hill? Well, I support officers walking and bicycling. There are bicycle officers in the first district, which is Capitol Hill. May not be enough. I've not liked the reduction in the size of MPD, and we actually began reversing that last year. I don't know that it's correct. It'll be years to recover. When I chaired judiciary, the force was about 3,800 officers, and we're 200 to 300 officers less. Right now, I'd like to see us get back up to 3,800. That would help. Again, I like officers walking and biking, although walking is not that efficient unless you're talking about in a commercial corridor, which is a much more discrete area. It's, the city's big. Having walking police officers all over the city would require a lot of officers. Where I especially think there need to be more resources is with detectives and closing cases. Next question. I'm exhausted when I read some of these questions. I'm exhausted when it comes to how these agencies operate. For instance, ANC 8A has had nearly 2 years of quarterly financial reports that were never introduced into any meeting and were never signed, resulting in the offices of ANCs preventing allotments from the district. They inform the leadership, yet this sort of action was never communicated to the constituents. How can 2 years of reports go by without any action taken and without informing the general public? I'm not quite sure how to answer that. ANC meetings are required by law to be public, and ANCs are required by law to approve their quarterly reports at their public meetings. The ANC presumably would be discussing at its meeting the fact that it hadn't filed reports or was not getting its allotments. If the ANC chooses not to do that, I'm not sure what we can do. The penalty for the ANC is that they don't get their money, and that's apparently what's happened. If the citizenry is paying attention, they would see that the ANC is being dysfunctional and would throw them all out in the next election. How can 2 years of reports go by without any action taken? Well, the OANC apparently took action by preventing allotments. And they, if I remember correctly, if they don't get a report due by, so the quarter ends December 31st. I think the report's due like the middle of February. If they don't get the report by the middle of February, then they don't pay the allotment for the first quarter of the year. So the penalty is almost immediate. So it sounds like this is really an AMC that, I mean, I don't know anything specifically about this specific AMC mentioned, but as described, it's an ANC that's not functioning well, and the recourse there for the public is to elect other commissioners. Next question, Chairman, would you consider a camera rebate program like the residential program for DC residents who purchase cameras for their cars that would help prevent carjackings and wheel rim theft? I don't know if there are cameras that really do that or are effective about doing that. I'm unaware, but we do have the Committee on Transportation and the Environment, and that's probably the place to look in terms of developing this idea or researching the idea and seeing if it makes sense to do that. Next question, should the DC Council and the mayor consider providing financial incentives for mental health clinicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists to move to the city, incentives for them to move to the city and work in the city for 3 years? Yeah, I think we should consider providing it. We have a new health committee chair, Christina Henderson. She's very much interested in whether there's adequate mental health professionals available for residents, for students, for teachers. I think the health committee should be looking at a variety of options and which ones make the most sense for increasing the mental health providers in the city. I know some of the strategies that we've looked at in the past is to increase the capacity at UDC for training mental health professionals. That's probably not psychiatrists, and I'm not sure they have a psychology program. And the council has increased the budget for both the community-based organizations as well as the schools to have mental health professionals. But there's a capacity issue here. The demand is much greater than the number of providers available. And yes, we should consider strategies for increasing the number of providers. Next question. The police union says that you introduced a bill that will pay reparations to anyone arrested for a marijuana-related offense prior to 2015. If the law back in the day was violated, a lawful arrest occurred, and the person arrested had due process, whether or not it was a guilty plea, where will this end? So I think what that question really means is that if somebody was lawfully arrested and convicted for a marijuana-related offense, then we shouldn't consider reparations. Well, reparations is a loaded term, but I just reintroduced with 6 other council members the Comprehensive Cannabis Legalization Regulation Act. And there's a provision in the bill was introduced this council period that's new because we've introduced it in the last council period, and it was introduced before that, I think, several times. We cannot move the legislation until Congress lifts the rider. But new to the bill just introduced is this provision for reparations for victims of the war on cannabis. The drug wars, which really set back a lot of folks in lower income communities. And where we are today as a society is that we say that the use of cannabis should not be unlawful. And so it doesn't really matter whether the arrest and the conviction was legal and proper 20 years ago. It is, I mean, this is a policy choice. That's what it is. And people can have different views of right and wrong on this. But if we think that if we think today the behavior is okay, then do we want to give an assist to folks who were disadvantaged by that same behavior 20 years ago when society thought differently that it should be punished? There are significant labor market consequences from incarceration. It affects not only the individuals incarcerated, but oftentimes the family. And if the family is struggling with poverty, then it makes it that much harder to get out. And what we're trying to do in a very general way, to put this in a very general way, is to look at the opportunity, the potential for raising money, tax revenue from the lawful sale of cannabis, taking that money that is in a sense a windfall to the government and putting it back into the communities that were most adversely affected by the war on drugs. Now, you may disagree with that, but this is our thinking with regard to equity, that if we want to help people who were, people who are living in poverty and whose ability to get out of poverty was made more difficult, in this case by the war on drugs, or in other instances by systemic racism that made it difficult for Blacks to build wealth by buying housing, getting housing, or affordable housing, then I think this is fair and reasonable. This is a bill that's introduced. We can't move it until Congress lifts the rider, but when they lift the rider, we will have a hearing and we will get testimony on this. I do think the use of the term reparations is loaded, but the concept here is a fair one, and let's get testimony that says where the problems are with this, or where the flaws are with this, or how we could improve this, or maybe even that it will not have a beneficial effect at all, but I'm not sure that's the case. The next question, how do parents you've met with feel about SRO, that's school resource officers in schools? My opinion is categorically no. We need more mental health supports and peer-led crisis in collaboration with clinical workers in schools. I'm 100% certain we don't need more armed police. Well, the question started out with, how do parents that I've talked with feel about SROs? And I would say that majority of parents would like to see school resource officers, a majority of teachers would like to see school resource officers, a majority of principals would like to see school resource officers. I do think we need more mental health supports in our schools, but I think that's a misunderstanding of what school resource officers do, and they're not simply armed police sitting in schools. I don't think there are any SROs who are assigned to a single school, and I don't think there ever have been. Maybe there's an exception there, but generally the school resource officers are assigned to multiple schools. And so they know a neighborhood, a community, and they generally know the students in a school. I think it's fair to compare it to officer friendly as opposed to an armed occupier. But I'll add this, there are a lot of incidents that relate to schools but don't occur in the schools. They occur outside the schools, like right outside the schools. And I would rather have a school resource officer who's trained, specially trained, to work with students. I'd rather have a school resource officer responding than an untrained, ordinary police officer responding. So I think the problem with the SRO debate is that people think that these are police officers who are assigned to and just stationed in a school and are policing the school like an armed occupier, when in fact it's a much more specially trained and sensitive assignment to multiple schools, knowing the students and assisting the teachers and the principal with regard to security concerns, especially outside the school. I will add this. I was at a meeting that the mayor convened with school principals. It was to talk more broadly about issues important to schools, and also the concern that schools have about the violence that's been occurring among teenagers in our city. But there was discussion about school resource officers, and there was one principal who said, spoke specific of an incident where I think it was in Anacostia, that there had been a shooting near the metro station where a lot of the kids go after school for their transportation. And the principal relied on the school resource officer for guidance on whether to be releasing the kids when there had just been this violent incident or whether to hold the kids in the school. And the school resource officer was a very important source of advice and guidance to the principal. The next and last question I have, Declan, is there a recall process for council members and how do residents go about starting one? Yes, there is a recall process for all elected officials. It requires 10% of the registered voters. So I'm at large, that would be 10% of all of the registered voters in the city. For a ward member, it would be all of the registered voters in the ward. And so there has to be a petition that is signed by 10% of the voters. And I'm looking at the code right now. A recall cannot be conducted during the first year or last year of a term. That's with regard to the 4-year terms. I think it's different for A and C commissioners. It's got to be. And the thinking behind that is that I have to have been in office for at least a year to establish that I'm unfit and I should be recalled. Or in the last year, there's going to be an election. So what is the purpose of going through the recall? A recall is not a speedy process, but it is an ability to get rid of an incumbent who is unfit for office. Declan, questions?
Yep. We have gotten a couple questions submitted during the meeting, as well as one question in the Facebook chat. As a reminder, if you do have another question, you can put it in the chat, email it to us, or submit it via direct message to one of the chairman's accounts. So first, going to the Facebook chat, the question is, will the council ensure that all teachers who worked the last 3 years will be paid retroactively, not freezing out 1,000 of them?
I'm not sure I understand the question, not freezing out 1,000 of them. There are different attributes to the retroactive pay. Some of it, I believe, is only for teachers who are still in the system. That might be the retention bonuses. As I'm sitting here, I don't know the details. I just dealt with the city administrator regarding a contract that was negotiated and approved last summer with nurses, a multi-year contract with some retroactive payments which had not been made on time. And so it's always a challenge to make sure that these payments are made. But they don't all happen at once. I know that. That's part of what the hearing will be about, is to better understand when the payments will be made. Declan?
And the next question we had emailed to us during the meeting. Will you fully fund the MPD? Currently, there are 3,300 sworn officers. That is 700 below full funding. That equals roughly 100 less officers per district and 33 less per shift. There are PSAs that go many shifts without anyone on patrol. Crime, especially violent crime, has been on the rise.
Well, there's a lot in that question. As I said earlier, when I chaired Judiciary Committee, there were 3,800 officers. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less. 3,800 is the number that we've had for a very long time. I'm not sure it's accurate that there's 3,300, but it is substantially below 3,800. And as I said earlier, I support our going back up to 3,800. I don't think there should be a hard and fast line. Now, the questioner clearly thinks 4,000 is the right number. I don't think we've ever been at 4,000. We started to get close for a hot moment and fell back. The questioner would be correct that when you have fewer officers, then you're going to have fewer officers in patrol and staffing the different shifts at the different districts. Of course, there are many, many other officers who are not doing patrol or at the districts, like the detectives and the undercover and the special units. But all that, yeah, is constrained by when you have fewer officers, and I would like to see us get more officers. And as I also said earlier, the council with last year's budget reversed the direction that we had been going in after George Floyd's murder. Declan?
So we are a couple minutes past 6. I do have one more question that was submitted during the meeting, and I will check the Facebook chat throughout this if there are any last questions. But the last question we had submitted reads, the local residents voting rights bill is currently in congressional review. Are you generally in favor of council member bonds, including the required funding of $1.42 million in fiscal year 2023 and $1.64 million over the financial plan? Can you commit to finding the funding for this bill in the committee of the whole if necessary and to ensure it's in place before the next election?
I like these compound questions. So I'm unaware of where those numbers came from. I'm guessing they came from the fiscal impact statement. Presumably the mayor will fund this as part of her submitted budget. If she doesn't, then I would look to Councilmember Bonds to fund it. The money may not be necessary. No, we have the FY24 budget, so that would be the FY24 primary election. I can't commit that if the mayor doesn't fund it and Councilmember Bonds doesn't fund it, I can't commit that that's going to be a priority in the committee of the whole. That's not to say no. Was there more to that? Where I expected the question to go was acknowledging that there are members of Congress who are not our friends who have vowed to overturn that legislation. And I'm fully prepared to do whatever's necessary to defend that legislation from a congressional override. I think we need to, Congress needs to respect our local authority. We just had a press conference today on reintroducing statehood in the Senate. So this issue is kind of front and center in my head today. Yes, Congress delegates to us the Home Rule Act, but Congress has done a pretty miserable job of governing the district before it gave us home rule. And since then, it's been really problematic. You know, we can't fill judicial vacancies on our courts. Congress can't work things out, so we're subject to being shut down. We couldn't call out our own National Guard when the Capitol was being busted on January 6th. Right now, you know, recreational cannabis in the district is a mess because Congress has that rider which will not let us regulate. So it's legal to use and possess, but it's illegal to sell. And this is all courtesy of Congress. So they need to stay out of our affairs because they don't know how to govern us. And besides, as a democracy, we should be governing ourselves. So the question as to the money, I can't make a commitment, but we passed the legislation, now support funding, and the mayor is the one who should provide the funding. Declan, I'm happy to take a few more questions. We started late.
Sure. We have a follow-up in the chat to the question about back pay for teachers who worked the last 3 years. The commenter said, Phil, you begged off on the teacher back pay. 1,000 teachers will not get retroactive pay because of a DC code provision that you can change or delete. The provision requires that one be on DC payroll, but if they did the work, shouldn't they be paid? DC law requires equal pay for equal work.
I think it's more complicated than that. This is a collective bargaining agreement. It's a contract that was negotiated between the executive and the bargaining unit, the Washington Teachers Union. Both parties bargained with eyes wide open with regard to who would get whatever benefits. I think the question has to do with people who are no longer teaching and whether they're entitled to some of the provisions. And I say some of because there's an increase for FY20, as I recall, and FY21 and 22, and an increase for FY23, and there's a retention bonus, and there's some other bonuses in there. And without knowing the specifics, I believe that not all of those provisions will benefit former teachers. And may be possible that none of them benefit former teachers because they've left the payroll. That's not a function of the law. That's a function of the collective bargaining agreement. But again, we will have a hearing, and so questions like this can be dealt with.
And I see one final question in the chat. It reads, is the council capable of regulating the discharge practices of entities like the Psychiatric Institute of Washington and other hospitals? Residents have reported patients being discharged without adequate clothing or the means to return to their places of residence.
I think I'd need to know more about the specific incidents and complaints, but I would say this. The council has broad authority to legislate. We can only go so far with regard to legislating behavior of private entities, but we can regulate, for instance, that private clinics should not be discharging patients without clothing. We could regulate something like that. So I think this is something that needs to be taken more specifically to the health committee for them to look into it, to better understand what the complaint is, and then from that see what the options are, whether it's regulation. It's probably not a law. It also might be a licensing issue. But then, in other words, doesn't even require any action on the part of the council, but that there was a licensing violation and enforcement can occur that way. I don't feel like I'm giving a good answer, but that's because I'm trying to respond to the basis of the question, which was some behavior which I don't fully understand, and whether that behavior can be prohibited because it's in violation of the license, or could be prohibited because it's a bad practice and therefore violates the regulations, or regulations should be crafted, or maybe it's behavior that is outside our authority. Declan, was that it?
Yep, we've gone through all the questions in the chat and all of the pre-submitted questions.
Before we hang up, I want to say the Committee of the Whole is having a hearing next Monday, the 31st, on my nomination to reappoint Kathy Patterson as the DC auditor for 6 years. That's Monday, the 31st at noon, I believe. And then we have a hearing on the small area plan developed by the Office of Planning for Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. That would be east of the river. That's a small area plan, not to be confused with the question earlier about DDOT and the work it's been doing on traffic management on East Capitol. This is Pennsylvania Avenue. We're also, those two hearings are January 31st. I don't think the hearing notice has come out yet. A hearing on the WTU contract on February 1st. I think that's at 11 in the morning, but as I said, you should go to the council's website to find the hearing notice. We will have a hearing on February 2nd on the annual comprehensive financial report. It used to be called the CAFR. It's now called the ACFR, Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. That's when, actually probably a couple of days earlier, the public will find out, I don't know yet, what surplus there was at the end of last year. We know there was a surplus because the revenue estimates from December indicated hundreds of millions of dollars above what had been, the budget had been based on. So we'll get all the details and have a public hearing on that on February 2nd. And the committee of the whole is scheduling a hearing, I believe, February 13th on school budgets. This is not the DCPS budget. This is the individual schools. We expect that by then the schools will have been informed by the chancellor what their budget is for next year. So I'm talking about Henley Elementary or Sousa Middle School or Ballou High School, 116 school budgets. And we are in some disagreement. I shouldn't say, we are struggling right now with the chancellor doesn't want to comply with the new law regarding schools first in budgeting. And so this hearing is in part to find out whether the chancellor is actually complying with the law or not. That's February 13th, I believe. All these notices should be available on the council's website, www.dccouncil.gov. And if you go to calendar, find the hearing and you click on it and you can get the hearing notice. I want to thank everybody. I've said this in the past, it's nicer to do this in person. It's probably more efficient to do it this way. Sorry I do so much talking, but I read the questions so that everyone knows what I'm answering. Thank you again, and we'll do this again in a month.